This then is the second episode in the follow-up on Ben talking about UFOs in earlier years throughout history. And now you're going to update us, bring us up to date through the 1800s up to possibly the early 1900s.
That's correct, yeah. So okay. Sort of 1800s, 1940s area, yeah.
So where are you going to start?
We can talk about the Aurora event if you want. That was quite an interesting situation, scenario that took place in Aurora is in Texas. And basically what happened was, to set the scene, it was a very rainy day, rainy evening rather, thunder and lightning. The weather in Aurora hadn't been particularly great for the last couple of days, and there was a judge in his home, and basically he was just about to sit down to have his evening meal, and there was a almighty crash, explosion of light, and he thought it was thunder and lightning. So he nonchalantly finished his meal, and then his wife said from the window, this is a situation, and there's something outside in the yard. Now, he lived essentially on what could only be described as a small ranch. It wasn't anything like, like most of the American ranches. It was kind of just a 2-3 acre thing. It was quite sort of tiny. So he got his wet gear on, went outside to be confronted with a very strange looking craft that had crashed into his windmill. Now, one of the things I need to mention about the windmills in America is they're not like the ones that you see here in the UK or in Holland, which are round and great big blades. These things are like metal towers, and I've got like metal wheels on them that actually go around, and they're there to drive for power like windmills here, but it's a slightly different setup. So he was confronted with this large craft that crashed into the his metal windmill. It was on the deck at a very interesting angle, about 30 degrees, the actual report says. He then walked around the craft to be then confronted with a body. So what happened was he then called, there's no telephones there obviously, he then basically decided it was a good idea to go and call on his neighbours, which were a couple of miles away. In the rain, he got on his horse and went to sort of the local areas, and they all came and congregated. What then happened was they found the body, whereby they then wrapped it up and they buried it in the cemetery, in the local cemetery. And then on top of that, the metals that had been come from this vehicle basically were then dumped in the well on the grounds. Couple of things happened there after that. Firstly, people started getting ill, and basically it's been rumoured that the metals have since been excavated by the CIA in the mid-60s, and it's also been rumoured that the body, which does actually have a stone in the cemetery saying that this body is here, recent investigations by a chap who's sadly no longer with us by the name of Jim Mars. He very famously wrote a book which the JFK film was based on. Basically, he and his team went and investigated it, and they found that through ground penetrating radar that the ground had actually been disturbed fairly sort of recently, in the last 30-40 years at the time. So basically, going back over that time period, that basically this body is now rumoured not to be there. So, but they couldn't get a clear identification through ground penetrating radar. It's quite an interesting case in the fact that if you look at it from a modern perspective, we've all heard of UFOs crashing and bodies being recovered. Obviously, the most famous case being in modern day history is the 1947 Roswell incident. But what people don't realise is there's actually been more crashes around the world before then. This being such a case in point, the Aurora event. Now, it is been told that apparently nothing actually happened that particular day, and that the reason why this story came about was bring more tourism to the spot, because of the fact that the railroad that had just been built had passed through the town. So, there is that kind of well, was it a fable, and sort of, just to get more people to visit, or did it actually happen? And if you look at the evidence of, people getting sick in the area after the event, and disturbed ground at the cemetery, it kind of poses a question. Did this actually take place? And the evidence, from what can be seen from it, suggests very strongly that it actually did.
Just a quick question there. The obvious question is: was there at that time? There would have been, wouldn't there? Was there any photographic evidence at all?
Well, strangely, one of the things that Jim Mars and his team did, they researched all of this. Now, there was paper clippings to say that this had taken place, but then back in the day of that time period, you could pretty much put anything in the paper and it would be believed. There wasn't that kind of due diligence as there is essentially. Well, I say essentially now. I use that in a loose term, obviously, with mainstream media being as it is. But basically, back then, there was that kind of right. Well, if it's in the paper, it happened kind of event. The other thing that they found, the team, was there were photographs of the metal windmill had crashed onto the ground. There was later photographs taken sort of in the late 1800s, early 1900s, later on down the line. Was it a vehicle that crashed into it? Who knows? But they did take photographs of this. I think the most comprehensive evidence is obviously from the ground penetrating radar that they took. That is I say, back then it was a very piece of new technology. Now it's, I wouldn't say aging exactly, but it's not new anymore. It is sort of getting on a little bit now. But back when they actually did this, in the early 2000s, it was relatively new technology. So the fact that they did it and they found that the ground had been disturbed, and they could not sort of bring it down to the last 20 years, 30 years or so, as an estimate, again, it's that kind of, did something really take place here? And there's still quite a lot of questions to be asked. I mean, they actually have a marker at the, in the cemetery, that not only have they got a marker where this body's supposed to be, it's actually got a plaque telling you all about the story. So yeah, it's quite an interesting sort of story in regards to.
Okay, but there's nothing on evidence of any if they had photography then, no photographs were taken of the craft and the being itself.
No, and that's a thing, you see, about taking photography of these supposed craft. What a lot of people don't realise is, and I mean, I'm going to touch on very briefly the events of the Betty and Barney Hill case. We'll talk about that in the next instalment, because that's more within the modern day era. Betty and Barney Hill, basically going down a road, the vehicle cut out. There's been people reported supposedly taken onto craft where the watches have stopped. There's been people saying that when they've been going down the road, a craft is supposed to have been over their car, and it's blown all the electrics. So, taking photographs of these craft is quite difficult because it drains batteries. They've found that it really interferes with the electronics of our systems. So taking a photograph is not easy, and back then, photography is done in a slightly different way. Yeah. So you can imagine it was difficult to take a photograph.
Okay, and the next incident.
So the next incident we can talk about is, again, keeping in the US, was the events of the early 1800s, the Withington event in Tennessee. So there was a chap who was quite an outdoorsman. He loved going walking with his dogs. Loved fishing with his friends. He would go out on the river on a boat, do fishing, and sort of, as 1800 people would do back then. What they would famously do is go out, and they wouldn't pop a few beers or anything like that. They'd take out a meal and a picnic and have a couple of glasses of wine and things like that. And it was all very, very sort of, laissez-faire, kind of relaxed. And what was happening was, this chap was going out in the morning walking his dogs, and he was getting followed by 5 orange red orbs. And this happened for weeks. Every single day he would go out, these orbs would be there, and they would follow him down the river. And he sort of made nothing of it. But then what happened was a couple of his friends turned around to him and said, "Hey, fancy going fishing?" And at which point he went, "Yeah, okay, then why not?" Gets in the boat, takes a meal with him, goes out into the middle of the river, only for these 5 orbs then to surround the boat. And literally, he said in his diary that you could essentially stand up and pretty much raise your hand and you could potentially touch them. They were that close. And basically, every time they tried to move away from these orbs and rowed the boat further down the river, they would follow them. You know. Now, obviously, we all know in the 1800s there was no flying vehicles back then. I mean, I think it was 1903 was when the Wright brothers took off from Kitty Hawk. So the question is, what were those flying vehicles? You know, these orange orbs were spotted regularly, and so he was a witness to them. And as an independent witness, you're thinking, really, did that take place? But then when his friends also saw them, that added credence to what he'd been telling them. So again, you're asking questions of what were these orange orbs that were following them, you know, and it became a regular sighting over the next 5 to 6 months. And then basically it kind of drew a bit of a crowd. So now the local townsfolk were seeing these things on a regular basis. And then one day they just stopped. No sight of them, no sign of them anymore, and they just went away. So, you know, again, questions that have to be asked. What were they? Why were they there? How come they chose that spot? And most importantly, you know, why were they following this chap every time he was out and about walking his dogs and being in the outdoors? So that was a very famous case. So that was in the about 1836. That happened.
Just quick question on that. Was it reported that the orbs emitted any noise at all?
No, they said they were silent.
Silent?
Yeah, so he wrote in his diary that these orbs were floating on the water like feathers. And I'm paraphrasing that, of course. And he was saying that there was no sound, there was no crackling, it was just an orange light, you know. And these are quite a common thing. I mean, as I said in the previous video, Christopher Columbus also wrote in his diaries in the 1400s on the way to the new land that he also witnessed these orange orbs guiding into the new land before he landed in America, you know, supposedly. So they are a common sight. I mean, if you go to the History Channel, they've been doing recently a documentary on a ranch. Basically, orange orbs are constantly spotted on this ranch consistently, you know. So they are a common theme within sort of UFOs. Usually, it's either orange orbs, blue orbs, white orbs, and these orbs have even been spotted indoors as well with people. So, yeah, it's quite a common one, that one. The next one we'll go across the big pond and go to the country of Sweden and Scandinavia. So in the 1800s it started. It was actually reported in the 1930s as well, with what were called the ghost rockets. And what was happening was there was a young boy, very famously this happened in the 1930s, but he'd gone out with his grandfather, and his grandfather was teaching him how to fish. This young man could have been no older than between 10, 12 years old, and basically as he was out on the water, he had an almighty splash, and then ripples went across the lake, and then he heard another splash, and then another splash, and then another splash, and there was like 5 consecutive splashes, one after the other, and he turned around to find nothing but explosions of water and ripples going through, fairly big waves in this lake, yet nothing was being detected. He didn't see anything. So, but if you go back to the early 1800s, in the same area, this has been going on since then. People reporting huge, ginormous splashes in the water, but not actually seeing anything land. You know, and that in itself is a bit bizarre. You know, what was landing? Now, okay, people could argue in saying that items were landing in the water. There could be meteorites traveling so fast that the eye didn't pick them up, and that can happen. You know, because our eyes only track it up to a certain speed. Again, touching on the modern day, there's been plenty of video evidence, and even on live TV. There was a famous case of the BBC doing a film of the weather. I think it was in Liverpool or Derby or somewhere like that. And basically, it was Liverpool, actually, I remember it now. They were filming Liverpool Docks area, and an orange light came flint across the screen, and they had to slow it down, and it was an orange elongated orb, and so, but yeah, the human eye didn't pick it up. So, the question is, what was falling into this lake, and apparently, it didn't just stop in the sort of late 1930s. Apparently, it's still been going on now. Occasionally, not as often as it used to. I think the last report of one was around about 2008, 2009 time period. So people thought they were coming back again, but yeah, again, there's a question: what are they? And nobody knows. And there's been no. Yes, there's been things put in the papers, but there's been no photographic. And why not? Because if the human eye can't pick it up, what chance of a camera picking it up back then? The technology wasn't about. So again, they were a very famous case. 1800s as well. One of the most famous cases in the 1800s was the event that took place in Japan. So basically, there's a place in Japan. I can't pronounce the name. I apologise to those on the internet if I crash this name. Ergusbera or something like that. It's a really very difficult name to pronounce. You can go on the internet and obviously do the research. There's been a lot of documentation about this. So there was Japanese fishermen on the beach. They were pulling the nets in, and what happened was they came across what can only be described as, in their diaries, an iron boat. Well, back then, iron boats were very rare, and this thing wasn't designed like any normal boat. In fact, they actually, the fishermen drew pictures of it, and what it looks like is a UFO, but turned upside down. Okay, and what happened was a lady got out of this UFO, and she was dressed very strangely. She had what was described as light pale green skin, spoke a language that the Japanese people didn't understand, and she had a box with her. And when anybody tried to help her get out of the vehicle and tried to grab the box, she wouldn't let anybody touch this box at all. And it transpired that this person, this lady, whoever she was, stayed with the Japanese village and the fishermen for a while. Turns out she was injured, but then one day they woke up to go and take her food, and she was no longer there. And that was a very famous case. It's, like I said, research Japanese UFO incident, and it's there, well documented. Now, okay, cameras weren't available in Japan at that time period, but what they are very famous for is having very good drawing and calligraphy. So they documented this hugely. They were very good at writing things down as they happened and recorded. So there is a lot of evidence for that one.
And she was actually eating food.
Yeah, she was eating green food. She wasn't eating your meat. She was eating vegetables, apparently, and leafy vegetables, predominantly, supposedly. And basically, yeah, she was. She found it very difficult to communicate with the people. But I mean, what human being are you aware of that has light pale green skin and spoken a language that people didn't recognise? So that was an interesting case of the 1800s. Obviously, then as well, we had another event that was in the US. Was the airships. So these were spotted quite a lot of the time within Arizona area. As you know, the new frontiers were opening up there. We've gone from cattle ranching and the famous cowboys and Indians and that time period now to the railroad. And basically what was happening was cattle ranchers were going out and to get the cows and herd them up and things like that. And they were spotting what can only be described as airships with propellers on them. Now, that's a bit strange because...
Wait a minute, what year roughly would this be?
This was 1800, 1802.
1802,
Yeah. So, the Zeppelin wasn't invented until, I think, if memory serves me correctly, late 1800s, early 1900s. In fact, the first documented balloon was the Montgolfier brothers, the French.
Yeah, I was going to say, what year was that roughly?
That was roughly middle 1800s,
Okay, so that's
1847
later. Yeah.
kind of area. Don't quote me on that. It's around about that time period.
Yeah.
But yeah, and their balloon was quite interesting. What their balloon was a dome-shaped balloon with 4 strings, and what can only be described as like kind of like your lanterns that you release out in Southeast Asia, like a fire, and it would heat the air, and off it went. Well, in the balloons and the Zeppelins that I was talking about, these things were apparently, according to what has been documented, were long, thin, slim balloons that had propellers on them, and that was spotted not just in Arizona but Idaho, Utah, all sorts of places around the sort of the Midwest, and this was happening for at least 18 months. So people at first thought it could be the circus, because back then the circus was becoming a big thing, but it wasn't. Obviously the military weren't kind of at that level yet of technology. Yes, it was a military there, as we all know. General Custer and kind of that time period was knocking about. Again, they didn't have any flying machines that we're aware of, and there's been non-documented. So what were these airships?
Well, the question there is, if they were of another world, would they have really had prop propulsion, or would it just have been described as such because the people at the time didn't have the language and they perhaps imagined
well, propellers back then weren't in the zeitgeist, as it were, in the Rubicon, and linguistically. However, I just want to take you back to the previous video we did of the ancient times. I very briefly touched on the story of Ezekiel in the Bible, and they actually, in the Bible at the time, they turned around and said it was a wheel within a wheel. So that to me sounds very much like a propeller, if you think about it. So it's a bit of a difficult one, that one, because how do you describe something like that in that time period? Propellers really weren't about then. I think the nearest they had to describe it something like a windmill, potentially. Other than that, that was it. So it was quite a difficult one to describe, really, that one.
Yeah.
So overall, I mean, they're the 5 subjects that I want to talk about, because obviously 20 minutes or so video, people sort of maintain the interest, which reminds me about the video. So as it's a fairly new channel and we're trying to build our following, it'd be really good if you could like, subscribe, and also click the bell, because when you click the bell, what happens is whenever we upload a new video, it will automatically tell you that we've actually done that and the video is now dropped. So it will remind you to come and watch it. Feel free to drop a comment, and also feel free to share these videos far and wide.
Yeah. In particular, we do welcome the comments, because what the dynamics of a good debate about these strange phenomena.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm always about free speech. It's very important to the way these stories have come about and have been documented is because people have been asking questions. What were they? Why are they here? What did they want? Who are they? These are just some of the things that we're looking into at the moment, and especially in the modern day era, which we'll talk about in another video.